what happened to me was filled with hate and vengeance. And I do not want to be like that. I cannot live my life like that. I need to be free. I think forgiveness is really an act of freedom.
Hello and welcome to How to Be a Money Magpie. It's a podcast from MoneyMagpie.com, and I'm Jasmine Birtles, the founder of MoneyMagpie. This podcast looks at all aspects of money, from making money, spending it, saving it, investing it. And every now and then we talk about something a bit different. And this is one of those times because it's Christmas. And I thought that one of the things that we all need to learn about, I certainly do, is forgiveness. And that's why my podcast guest today is the wonderful Marina Cantacuzzino, who set up and runs the charity called The Forgiveness Project. Hello, Marina.
Hello, thank you for inviting me on.
Really, it's something I've been meaning to do for quite some time. And I thought Christmas, forgiveness is a biggie. Literally, it is something I think about a lot, because I think that I need to get much better at this. And to be honest, most of us need to get better at forgiveness. Have you found that it's a quality that really helps your life?
It's an interesting one. I think I always was quite a forgiving person. Maybe that's why I'm interested in this subject. I think it came from my mother. She was always extremely good at saying sorry if we ever had a row. I was more interested in why it was some people couldn't forgive and how the people lock horns, how families fall apart, how fragile people are really. And I notice it increasingly that you talk to anyone, and I'm sure you've noticed this, and everyone's got a story about someone who hasn't forgiven them, who won't talk to them, and someone they won't forgive and have stopped talking to and cut all ties with. And I find it, increasingly fascinating as to why this happens and why people get so stuck. And I've always been interested in it. And really, I think that's what led me as a journalist to sort of exploring the subject. But actually, I have to say, initially, not through the small, everyday transgressions and grievances we have, but much more with sort of big stories of crime and violence.
Yeah, you really do have, as you say, big stories of crime and violence on the website, on the Forgiveness Project. And you've interviewed on the F Word podcast, which I listen to and I enjoy, some people who have forgiven the most heinous crimes against themselves and against family members, which is almost harder to forgive. We're funny that way. What are the main things that you've learned from the people who were able to forgive?
I mean, I think the main thing for all of them is this desire to heal. Pain is the great motivator to forgive. And people become very aware that when they are stuck and trapped with vengeance and feelings of hatred and loathing, and they ruminate about it and they think about it all the time, they can't let it go. It becomes the driving force and story of their life. It's then that people often decide, and it is often a decision, and it often takes years, I have to do something differently because what I'm doing isn't working. And that is what takes people to consider, to explore, to line themselves up for forgiveness. And people do it in multiple ways, for multiple reasons. Very occasionally, it doesn't take years. Very occasionally, it's instantaneous. And it is just this innate desire, really, not to meet hate with more hate. Some people have that. But Jasmine, I have to say, I'm very clear as well that I don't want people to think if they can't forgive, they failed in some way. So the stories are nuanced. Some people, for instance, Rami Elahan, whose daughter was killed in the suicide bomb in Israel, he says very clearly, I do not forgive and I do not forget. But the suicide bomber was a victim like my daughter. He had grown bitter and crazy from poverty and shame. And so his way, he actually doesn't like the word forgiveness. And I include him within the Forgiveness Project because he is such a forgiving person. He exudes forgiveness and everything that means, compassion, empathy. And yet the word itself is limiting for him. So part of what the Forgiveness Project does, I think, is explores what this word means, what empathy is, what compassion is, and where these all fit in together.
It's interesting you talk about, what forgiveness actually means, because knowing that I was going to talk to you, I actually looked up the etymology, which I'm sure you know. It means, what I found was that it means to give completely. Would you agree with that? It sounds to me like you've got quite a lot of definitions of forgiveness.
Yeah, I try not to stick with one definition. I think it means to give up as well, to give up resentment and your desire for revenge. It means, if you have one word, it might mean freedom. It means not allowing the pain of the past to dictate the path of the future. It has so many meanings, but it's more than letting go, I think. It's more than acceptance, because it requires, and this is the difficult bit, a degree of empathy and compassion.
Mm.
I was in prison once with the Mizens, Barry Mizzen and his wife Margaret, whose son was killed in a brutal attack, unprovoked attack in South London a few years ago. And they were sharing their story about forgiveness, about forgiving the perpetrator who was in prison. And they said, and I remember Barry Mizzen very clearly saying to the prisoners, I don't think about them. I'm not even going to think about them. I blank them, the perpetrator he was talking about and those accomplices. And one of the prisoners said, but that's not forgiveness, he said. He really challenged him. He says, that's not forgiveness. You're just not thinking about it. You've blanked it. You've accepted it. But forgiveness is more than that. And I remember, they really did think maybe a little differently after that, about the way they described their forgiveness. Because there's no right or wrong, I have to say that as well. So for some people, forgiveness requires some kind of response from the perpetrator, apology, remorse. For others, that's not necessary at all. If you hang on to expecting that someone will apologize to you, then you may be falling into another trap, becoming inextricably linked to them, to that person who's hurt you, and you're not free. So everyone's journey is different. I think if I had got what you asked me, this is a long way of answering your question, what you asked me, sort of what I've learned about forgiveness, the single most important thing I've learned is that it is multifaceted and it appears and manifests different for everybody, in different ways for everybody.
And have you noticed any of the people that you've interviewed, losing physical pain or physical problems when they've forgiven?
Definitely. I'm always interested in that. As you say, the physical response. How does it feel in their body? It's very obvious in all the restorative justice stories that I've collected. Now, restorative justice is when a victim and an offender of a crime come face to face in order to make some sort of resolution about the way forward. And it's been very well researched, and is not only can reduce reoffending rates, but is also extremely helpful for victims who feel listened to and heard. And in all the interviews that I've done, all the victims describe feeling lighter, sleeping better, feeling less anxious, being able to go out more. There's always a very interesting response. Now, all those people I've interviewed also have come to a place of forgiveness. But in restorative justice, forgiveness should never be an intention, but it may well be an outcome. And so the stories that I've collected for the Forgiveness Project all do end in forgiveness. And this is how they describe it in this very physical way. So I'm really interested in that. But all the research also bears that out. People who forgive score higher on just about every psychological measurement that's available. They score higher in well-being. They score higher in the sense of better relationships, better marriages. And even there's some research that shows that people who are forgiving live longer. It's fascinating, really. But it's no surprise, because if you think about it, to forgive is, if we think of it as this releasing and this letting go of the rumination and all the thoughts that you have in your head that are causing you to be sad and sick. Then that if you are able to let go of those, you're less stressed.
It does make sense, as you say. Now, usually this podcast is about money, about saving, making, investing, etc. And I'm guessing again that because forgiveness enables you to live basically and start again and look forward rather than backwards, etc., it actually probably even helps your financial situation.
Well, it could. I'd be really interested if there's any actual research on that. I mean, certainly it impacts on your relationships, and I'm sure you will know that money comes into relationships a lot.
Big time. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting that I'd love to know.
And you've interviewed a lot of, I would say, quite remarkable people, though also quite ordinary people like us, who have forgiven, as I said, quite heinous crimes. Are there any that, if you like, are your favourites? You don't have to have one, 2 or 3 maybe, because literally they're all good. But are there any that stand out more than others?
I don't have favourites actually, but because all of them have taught me something different in different ways. But I can just share a couple if you like. Well, Marion Partington probably has taught me most about forgiveness. I met her early on when I was researching for stories that then became part of the Forgiveness Project. Marion Partington's sister was killed by Fred and Rosemary West, the serial killers. And she's since written a lot about forgiveness herself. She's probably thought longer and deeper about it than I ever had. And she writes beautifully. And she talks about, because Fred West committed suicide soon after he was found, it was discovered what they'd done, and he was in prison. So he never went to trial, but his wife, Rosemary West, did go to trial. And Marion Partington talks about how forgiveness for her began with murderous rage when she went on a retreat and was filled with so much rage in her heart that she knew at that moment she too was capable of murder. And then she just sets out on a journey to forgive. So it's a very clear intention. She lines herself up for it. She doesn't know how she's going to get to it. But part of it is seeing Rosemary West speak during the trial, and she recognizes what she says is the impoverishment of a soul that knew no other way of being than through terrible cruelty. Mm-hmm. And she saw this because Rosemary West described her own childhood, how she'd been raped, how she'd been treated appallingly. And so this deep compassion came up in Marion's heart, really. Mm-hmm. And she describes forgiveness in terms of an opening of the heart. And I think it has to be. And it can be triggered by all sorts of things. For Marion, it was partly triggered by seeing Rosemary West in court and realizing that some people have such terrible childhoods that they are become what Shakespeare calls ruined pieces of nature and do terrible things. So some people I've interviewed have come to that conclusion, but you can understand it in the sense that these people wake up with a compulsion to hurt. We do not have that in us normally, thankfully. We don't wake up in the morning wanting to be cruel. Mm-hmm. Some people are born like that. So that's where the compassion comes from, a terrible state of mind to be in. So Marion Partington has taught me an enormous amount. I also have collected what I call sort of perpetrator narratives, just for want of a better phrase. And this is because to share stories of people who have harmed others, I think really helps us understand where violence comes from, and especially if there's the transformation within there, if they can explain how that happened and how they came through it. So one example is Arno Michaelis, who used to be a white supremacist responsible for an inordinate amount of violence and harm in his life, until he walks into a McDonald's one day and he's got swastikas tattooed all over his fingers. And he goes up to this black woman at the till and she looks at him with compassion in her eyes. And she says, "You're worth more than that," she says, looking at his fingers. And he describes this compassion in this woman's face as something he'd never experienced before. And he says he fled the McDonald's and vowed never to go back there. But in that moment, he realized that people he'd hated had showed him empathy, compassion, even love. And it was, in a way, the rehabilitating factor in his life that got him to completely change his life around. He started an organization soon after called Life After Hate. He does a lot of work with violent extremism now, and about trying to bring young people away from hurting others, and trying to create less division in the world. Goes into schools, and he often says it was the forgiveness of those that he once hated that brought him from there to here. These stories, I think, show processes of forgiveness, and it's a way that other people, like yourself, can access it through lived experience. Because I've always felt as a journalist that the personal narrative is more powerful than if an expert tells you about research, or a psychologist tells you this is how to forgive. I'm a journalist. I believe in the power of stories and narratives, and that's my vehicle, if you like, to sharing it with others. I think people's stories stick, whereas facts fade. And I know that they have more impact in creating a safer and better world than reams of research or expert opinion.
True. And as you're talking about that second story, which to me feels like it's something outside, something higher than just sort of the human way of living that reached that man. It reminds me of probably my favorite of your interviews, which is Azim Kamisa, whose son was murdered just randomly in a gang killing. And because I spoke to him, I actually, after listening to your F Word podcast interview with him, I linked in with him and we had a chat.
Right.
Yeah, it was fascinating because he told me that when he heard of his son's death, he was on the phone. His son's girlfriend told him, and he said it was like a nuclear explosion. It was so terrible. He couldn't cope. He collapsed, and he said he left his body because it was too painful to be in his body. But having left his body, he felt love. He felt the love of the universe, the love of God. He's Muslim. And so when he came back into his body, he was able immediately to forgive. And I was hugely impressed by that. That has another dimension, I think.
Yeah. And he says when he came out of that, he understood that there were victims at both ends of the barrel of the gun. And from then on, he again is someone who's worked with youth and done tremendous good in creating more peaceful environments. He also said something to me that I always remember. He said, a broken heart is an open heart, which explained to me again why people who have suffered the most often have the most generous and open-hearted way of looking at the world and at others.
It is very hopeful. I think anybody watching or listening to this who has gone through what feels like real cruelty. I mean, we all have stuff. Everybody's got things that they've been through. But it does. I think it shows that everybody can do it. They really can. Do you have any advice for people who would like to forgive, or would really like to forgive, and just don't feel that they can get through what feels like a rock-ribbed wall, just a total closed door to it? What's your advice?
You said that someone who would like to forgive, I think that's almost like the most important thing. But those who do want to forgive, who see it as a way through, and who are stuck with that, all I could really offer, I think, is to look at the story of the other. So the person that has hurt you and is causing you so much pain, to try to understand why that might be, what has happened in their life, how they were as a child, to try and let go of the blame. It's very hard sometimes to do that when you feel that you're in the right. But sometimes the person who you're so angry and hurt by also feels they're in the right. So I think it's really important to look at that. There are two types of feuds, I think, sometimes. The ones where people both think they are right And if an outsider looks at it, a mediator might say, well, there's right on both sides. Then there's the sort of hurt and pain where it's quite clear that something very cruel has been done to you by another person, and that person may refuse to acknowledge that. They may have walked away, they may be dead. What do you do with that? And that is about coming to terms with that pain, and forgiveness can be very, very helpful in that respect. And I think you just do it by moving in towards the pain. You don't run away from it. That's why I present the stories. There's so many stories out there. You can see how people do it. Because very often it's triggered by something on the outside. They may not have thought about it. It may be a moment in a play that they're watching. It may be something someone says to them, a book that they're reading, that they start to shift their mindset. Research has shown that forgiving people have very flexible brains, very flexible ways of seeing the world, their perspective. So very often, if you're certain that the person who's hurt you is bad and evil and your enemy, you'll be stuck. But I think anyone who wants to forgive is already thinking about different ways of viewing that situation.
And I know you're not religious. I am. I'm a churchgoer. And one thing that has occurred to me about forgiveness, kind of from a Christian point of view, is something that Christians do talk about a lot. Yeah. And particularly in the Lord's Prayer, we have, forgive us our debts, our trespasses, as we forgive their debtors, our debtors, their trespasses, etc. Do you think that, religious or not, some of us have a sense that actually we're not entirely perfect, and we could do with forgiveness, from the universe, whether it's from the universe or from a particular person? You get angry about what somebody else has done, and then if you're really honest, you find you've done something similar or worse to somebody else. Does that ever come up in stories where you interview people?
I think one thing that comes across all the stories is that people who forgive have a degree of self-awareness and have done a certain amount of self-discovery and looking into themselves. Yes, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, I used to say that the Forgiveness Project was grittily secular until I was taken to task about it by Marion Partington, actually. She said, you're wrong. She said, every single one of those stories has a deep spiritual line running through it. And I think she was absolutely right. They may not be religious, although I'm very clear that I like to share stories from all religions and from none, so that you can get different perspectives. But I think what you're describing is similar to what I've noticed from all the many people I've interviewed and talked to, that there is some sort of spiritual connection with being able to forgive, or line yourself up to forgive, or not to hate.
I know you've got your website, theforgivenessproject.com. You've got the F Word podcast. You've also got some books, because I've got one of them, I know, The Forgiveness Project. And I've
got this one.
Yes, forgiveness. Forgiveness is very strange. That's the title.
Yeah, it's a graphic book in a way, so it's like very few words and lots of pictures, which was extremely difficult to write, actually, because most of it had to be cut.
And it has the benefits, I'm guessing, of forgiveness in it, as well as some stories, I believe.
Yes, it does. And it looks at a kind of process we look at the end about what is required to forgive, like curiosity, empathy, giving up resentment. And it also looks at meaning, this desire that we have as human beings to find meaning in our suffering. That is also a key component, really, of forgiving.
Yeah. And finally, as a final word, to those who are thinking about forgiving and maybe still feeling just tightened up, what do you think it would do for the world if even a few of us were able to forgive more than we are at the moment?
Well, I think it's such an important skill, attribute. I mean, obviously it would create a more peaceful society, which I think is especially in today's age with the bitterness of social media, I mean, there's very little forgiveness online these days. And so I just think our conversations would become easier. We become less defended. There'll be more collaboration, give up their differences and start to talk more. And we're just talking about little things, just not necessarily these big crimes and atrocities that I've focused on in order to grab people's attention, but all the little grievances and resentments that we hold on to. Very often we're unable to move into the other person's sphere and sort of understand where they're coming from. And I think that's because we're encouraged to do that. And the world that we live in has become very unforgiving.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Marina. This is Marina Cantacucino from The Forgiveness Project. You can find out more at theforgivenessproject.com and listen to the F Word podcast. And we've shown some of the books. So do have a look at the websites, listen to the podcast, and it's going to help. I think it's going to help everyone. Well, thank you, Marina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Don't forget to like and follow us on YouTube and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, you know the ones. It's at MoneyMagpie.com. Today's episode was presented by me, Jasmine Birtles, and the producer was Jenny Birtles.